Everybody in that room agreed it was the coldest thing Walter Grimes ever did to his own blood. Nora stood in the attorney's office while her brother and sister laughed at what she'd been given. A rusted key to a condemned farmhouse appraised at $9. A place everyone said deserved a wrecking ball. But as Raymond and Sylvia walked out clutching their checks, they had no idea they just handed Nora the only thing she truly needed. They mocked the ruin. They never once pictured Nora's swollen, aching hands setting each stone back into place. There would be no hidden fortune, no lucky break. She would carve her own worth out of wreckage, building something so undeniable that the very people who tossed her aside would return, begging for a place inside it. Stay with me through every word of this story, because the moment Raymond and Sylvia finally stepped through that farmhouse door and saw what Nora had created, their faces told the truth their mouths never could. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And if this story moves something in you, hit subscribe. Tomorrow there's something you won't want to miss. The law office of Hawkins & Briggs occupied the second floor of a slim brick building on Clarksville, Tennessee's Main Street. The kind of place that smelled of aging paper and furniture polish. Framed certificates lined the walls. The receptionist spoke barely above a whisper, as if the entire building existed in a permanent state of hushed importance. On the morning of March 14th, Nora Callahan lowered herself into a chair that was too rigid, too formal for a woman in a second-hand sweater and boots held together with electrical tape. She was 36. Her dark auburn hair was gathered back with a rubber band she'd fished from the bottom of her bag. To her left sat Chloe, 9 years old, silently tracing shapes on a notepad the receptionist had offered her. To her right, Ben, 6 years old, pressed against Nora's arm with that heavy, boneless stillness children carry when they've been dragged through too many days and not enough sleep. Nora's father, Walter Grimes, had died 5 weeks before. 71 years old, a stroke before dawn, gone before the paramedics pulled into the driveway. He'd been a quiet man, a complicated one. A former tobacco farmer who spent his final 2 decades drifting between cheap rural properties across Tennessee, buying low, selling lower, never quite assembling the life he always seemed to be reaching toward. Nora had been the one driving 4 hours every few months to look in on him. She'd organized his medications after his first minor stroke 3 years prior. Sat beside his hospital bed twice. Helped him make sense of the paperwork doctors pressed into his hands. She hadn't done any of it expecting repayment. She'd done it because he was her father. And because no one else showed up. Her siblings, Raymond and Sylvia, had their own orbits. Raymond, 43, operated a moderately successful landscaping company in Nashville. He had a gift for making his absence sound noble, like sacrifice. Sylvia, 41, had married into a cushioned life in Chattanooga. She communicated mostly through clipped text messages and the occasional birthday card that arrived 3 days late. Neither had visited Walter in the last 2 years of his life. Nora knew this not because anyone confessed it. She knew because every time she arrived at her father's small rental house, the guest room sat untouched, exactly as she'd left it on her previous visit. Same towel folded on the bed, same half-empty water bottle on the nightstand. Attorney Theodore Hawkins was a compact man in his late 60s. Silver reading glasses, the measured, careful energy of someone who had delivered hard news so many times he'd learned the only decent way was straight through, steady and without apology. He read the will in the order Walter had written it. Raymond received the savings account, $47,000. He also received the 2019 Ford pickup and a collection of antique farm tools Walter had kept in a rented storage unit. Sylvia received the investment portfolio, modest but real, valued at roughly $62,000. She also received Walter's personal belongings, his furniture, his books, his watches, the few pieces of jewelry their mother had left behind. Raymond let out a quiet breath of satisfaction. Sylvia permitted herself a small smile and jotted something in the leather notebook she'd brought along. already calculating. Neither of them looked at Nora. Hawkins stopped mid-breath. He pulled off his glasses, wiped them once with the cloth from his breast pocket, slid them back on. Then he turned to Nora with a look she would carry for the rest of her days. Not quite pity, something deeper. Something that already knew what the next words would do. Quote 0, quote 1. Raymond laughed first. A quick, clipped sound. The kind you make when you're trying to hold it in. Then it broke loose, and he wasn't trying anymore. Sylvia covered her mouth, but her shoulders gave her away. Nora didn't move. "What property is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dad picked it up at a tax auction about 8 years back," Raymond said, dabbing at his eye. "Paid $9. 9 actual dollars. Nobody else even bid. He always said he'd fix it up one day. Never touched it. The county's been on him for years. Either renovate or tear it down." "It's condemned," Sylvia added, steadying herself. "There was a fire years ago. One side partially damaged. Sections of the roof have collapsed inward. I believe there's even a structural violation notice filed against the property." She looked at Nora with something wearing the mask of concern. "It's a liability, Nora. That's what it is." Hawkins drew a manila envelope from his file and slid it across the table. Inside, documents and a key. Old iron, dark with age. Heavier than it appeared. "There is one condition," Hawkins said. "The property cannot be sold for 18 months from the date of Walter Grimes' passing. Once that period expires, you're free to sell or dispose of it however you choose." 18 months, Raymond muttered. "You'll be covering taxes on a condemned building you can't even get rid of." Sylvia leaned in. Her offer was already polished, already rehearsed. "When the 18 months run out, we'll take it off your hands. We could probably manage 10, maybe 15,000, enough to cover whatever you've sunk into it by then." $15,000. For a condemned farmhouse on 3.4 acres of Harlan County dirt that her father bought for $9. The contempt in that number was breathtaking. Nora picked up the key, rested it in her palm. Cold, solid. It settled into her hand like it had been waiting there. "Why would he do this?" she asked. Not to Raymond, not to Sylvia. To Hawkins, the only person at that table she trusted enough to hear the answer. Hawkins held her gaze. "He told me that each of his children was receiving exactly what they deserved and exactly what they needed. He said you, in particular, would understand what to do with it. Even if you didn't know that yet." Raymond said, rising, buttoning his jacket. He squeezed her shoulder once, a gesture that somehow landed like a goodbye and a dismissal in the same breath. __quote _16__. He left with Sylvia. They were already talking. Next steps, estate logistics, the truck. The investment account. Hawkins gathered his papers. He placed a second set of documents in front of Nora. A property survey, a county inspection notice, and a photograph. The photograph showed a 2-story farmhouse set back from a gravel road. White paint curling off in long, pale strips. A front porch sagging away from the house at an angle that made your stomach tighten. One upstairs window sealed with plywood. A handwritten no trespassing sign stapled to a post at the edge of a yard that had gone wild. Nora sat alone at the mahogany table. An envelope, a key, a photograph, and 2 children who had fallen asleep in their chairs without a single person in that room noticing. She stared at the photograph for a long time. She had nowhere else to be. She and the kids had been living out of her 2019 Honda Civic for 6 weeks. Ever since the apartment in Memphis she'd rented on her caregiver's salary became impossible the week her last client passed away. $214 in her bank account. 2 children. A car with a slow leak in the rear left tire. And now a condemned farmhouse in a county she'd never set foot in. Her brother thought it was a joke. Her sister thought it was an insult. But Nora Callahan looked at that photograph and saw something neither of them had bothered to look closely enough to find. Through all that damage and rot, through paint curling off in ribbons, and the porch leaning like a drunk man, and windows sealed behind plywood, the bones of that house refused to fall. Fire had tried. Neglect had tried. Tennessee winters had thrown everything they had. The walls held. And sometimes Nora stood there, turning that key over in her fingers, and thought, the walls are the whole point. She woke Chloe and Ben softly, pulled them both close in the parking lot outside Hawkins and Briggs, held them there in the sharp morning air for a moment longer than necessary. Then she strapped them into the backseat, typed 22 Dust Mill Road into her phone, and turned the engine over. They had a farmhouse to meet. The drive into Harlan County ran just under 2 hours. Nora drove the way she'd learned to drive over the past 6 weeks. Radio dead, eyes fixed ahead, mouth shut. Her mind cycling through the same worn arithmetic it always did when every option was bad and she needed to manufacture one from nothing. Chloe sat behind her, turning pages of a library book she'd borrowed 3 towns back and never brought home. Ben had slipped under again, his cheek flattened against the glass, lips parted. The city thinned. Nashville's sprawl crumbled into smaller towns, then hamlets, then long open corridors of rural Tennessee, fields stretching wide, dark tree lines marking property edges. Farmhouses set so far from the road they seemed to be hiding from company. Nora had grown up in country like this, not far from here. She understood the weight of silence in these places, how it sat differently than city quiet, heavier, blunter, more honest. She remembered the smell of red clay softened by rain, the way spring light fell across an open field like it had nowhere better to be. Driving deeper into this landscape didn't feel like going somewhere unfamiliar. It felt like sliding back into a life she'd walked away from without realizing she was leaving. The GPS pulled her off the highway onto a county road, then off that onto gravel running between 2 fields choked with thistle and wild grass. A rusted mailbox tilted at the property line, the numbers 22 barely legible under a crust of brown corrosion. Nora turned in slowly. Gravel popped beneath the tires. She rolled maybe 100 yards before the farmhouse revealed itself fully and her foot found a brake on its own. The photograph Hawkins had shown her, it had lied. Not intentionally. Distance had done the lying, softening edges, blurring damage. In person, there was no mercy. 2 stories of weathered white perched on a low stone foundation, and every inch of it looked like it had been losing a slow argument with time for 30 years. The front porch had pulled away from the house on the left side. It leaned toward the earth at an angle that suggested one good gust would finish the conversation. Every ground floor window was either sealed with plywood or shattered entirely, glass long gone, frames darkened and swollen with moisture. The fire Sylvia had mentioned had eaten most of the right side of the second story. The exterior wall there was charred black and bowing outward. A section of roof above had caved inward, leaving a raw, open gash in the roofline. Dark rafters exposed to open sky like broken ribs. Weeds owned the yard, every square foot. A collapsed fence ran along the left boundary, its posts rotted through at the base, lying flat in the grass. Not fallen, surrendered. Behind the house, Nora could make out what had been a barn, now a skeleton of grey timber, holding its own shape through stubbornness alone. An old county notice stapled to a wooden stake near the drive read, 18, in heavy black letters. Faded but readable, the county seal still visible beneath the weather damage. Ben had woken during the slow crawl up the drive. He pressed his face to the glass, stared. 19. Nora looked at it a long time before she answered. 20, she said. Chloe glanced up from her book. 21. 22, Nora said. 23. She said it with more steel than she actually felt, because that was what you did when your children were watching you decide whether or not to be afraid. She stepped out of the car and walked toward the house. The yard was soaked from recent rain. Weeds drenched her boots to the ankle before she'd taken 3 steps. She circled the property first, the way her father's illness had taught her. Walked the whole boundary before stepping inside. Studied the foundation, the roof line, every exterior wall. The stone foundation was old, solid. Mortar had crumbled in spots, but the stones themselves sat massive and unmoved. The left side and the front of the house, untouched by fire, stood structurally sound. Wood had gone soft in places, yet the framing beneath still held. The porch looked terrible. Cosmetic wreckage, nothing more. Not structural. The right side and part of the rear told a different story entirely. Fire had done real work there. Years of open exposure had finished what the flame started. But the bones remained. Nora stood at the back of the property, put distance between herself and the house, and forced her eyes to see not what was, but what could be. Generous proportions, large windows, a footprint wider than she'd expected. 3.4 acres stretching behind her, and somewhere along the back edge, a creek she could hear but not yet find with her eyes. A barn, damaged, leaning, but not gone. She walked back to the car, retrieved the key from the envelope. The front door was chained shut with a padlock rusted nearly through. She didn't even need the bolt cutters she'd bought on the way. Steady pressure. The chain snapped, dry and dead. The old iron key ground into the lock. It resisted. Rust on rust, metal fighting metal. Then a deep mechanical click that echoed off the porch boards. Nora pushed the door open. The smell came first. Damp wood, ash, old earth. And beneath all of it, something she couldn't name yet. Something dry and faintly sweet. Old paper maybe. Cedar. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes pull detail from the dimness. Chloe appeared at her left side, Ben at her right. One child under each arm, all 3 of them looking in together. They stood at the threshold of a condemned farmhouse in Harlan County, Tennessee. $200 in the bank, nowhere else to go. Nora took a breath. Then she stepped inside. The interior was darker than the outside had prepared her for. She moved through the entrance slowly, phone light slicing the dimness, Chloe and Ben close behind. The entry hall ran narrow, maybe 4 feet wide, low ceiling, walls covered in peeling wallpaper. Faded floral pattern, yellow and green, bubbled and curling away from the plaster in long strips. The floor was white plank wood buried under debris, plaster dust, leaves blown through broken windows, scattered remains of what had once been furniture, a 3-legged wooden chair, a picture frame with no glass, its backing swollen with moisture. Nora tested each step before giving it her weight. The boards flexed, held. She moved into what had been the main living room and stopped. Even through the damage, the room was larger than expected. Ceilings ran higher than typical farmhouse construction, close to 10 feet, unusual for a rural Tennessee property this old. The fireplace on the far wall stretched brick from floor to ceiling, wide enough to stand inside. Its mantel still intact beneath thick gray dust. 2 windows flanked it, both boarded from outside, but large, their frames revealing the kind of width and height that would flood this room with light the moment those boards came down. She moved through to the kitchen, smaller, practical. A cast-iron wood-burning stove stood against the back wall, heavy and dark and entirely solid. Counters had rotted through in places. The sink had pulled away from the wall. But the layout made sense, and the exterior wall showed no structural compromise. A back door led to what had been a small covered porch. Beyond it, the yard, the barn. The door hung crooked in its frame, but opened when Nora lifted it slightly and pushed. The right side of the house. She approached carefully. Fire damage concentrated here, in what had been a sitting room or study. The ceiling above had partially collapsed, dragging sections of the second floor down with it. Nora did not go far into this room. She stood at its entrance, assessed, stepped back. This was not where she would start. This was a problem for later, for when she had more knowledge, more resources, and something closer to a plan. The staircase climbed the left interior wall, far from where the fire had done its worst. It surprised her. The treads were wide, thick-cut timber that had barely shifted across however many decades this house had stood. Nora went up slowly, hand against the wall, testing every step. The second floor split into 3 rooms. The 2 on the right showed smoke damage, one with a whole section of roof caved in, letting a column of gray afternoon light fall through like a wound. But the bedroom on the left side, the fire had never touched it. Small, square, a single window that looked out over the fields. Dusty floor, but level. Walls intact. This would be their room. For now, at least. That evening, she made up 2 sleeping areas on the floor with blankets hauled from the car. She found a section of kitchen floor that held solid, swept it clean with a branch dragged from the yard. They ate crackers and peanut butter by the glow of her phone. Ben dropped into sleep the way he always did, completely, without argument. Chloe lay on her back, staring at the ceiling for a long time before she spoke. Quiet, almost a whisper. Nora lay beside her in the dark, looked at that same ceiling. She said, "The first week belonged to survival and assessment." She drove into the nearest town, a small place called Millbrook, 12 miles down the county road, and bought the cheapest cleaning supplies she could find. Broom, mop, garbage bags, a box of basic tools, a utility knife. 2 full days she did nothing but haul debris from the ground floor. Bag after bag carried out and stacked at the edge of the property. She found rhythm in the labor the way she always had with physical work. That kind of rhythm that silences the thinking mind and lets the body lead. She set a camp stove on the kitchen counter for heating water and cooking simple meals. She located the water shutoff and the electrical panel, both disconnected, both needing professional hands before they could be safely restored. 2 broken ground floor windows she sealed with plastic sheeting and duct tape, enough to keep wind and animals out. She braced the front porch supports with lumber scavenged from the barn. Not a real fix, just enough to stop the lean from worsening before she could address it properly. By the end of that first week, the ground floor was clear. She could walk through every room without stepping over something. The house felt different when it was clean. It breathed differently. There was a quality she hadn't been able to sense through all the wreckage. Something solid and purposeful in the way it had been laid out. The way each room flowed into the next. It was during the second week that it started. Nora was in the living room, pressing her hand along the wall beside the fireplace, checking the plaster for soft spots, anything that might signal water damage or structural failure behind it. She pressed her palm flat and felt it. Not softness, not damage, something else entirely. A seam, straight, deliberate, running vertically from about knee height to above her head. Not a crack from settling, a seam that had been plastered over and painted, intentionally concealed, but unmistakably there under her fingers. She pressed harder. The wall gave slightly, not collapsing, flexing. In a way that solid plaster over solid framing should never flex. Nora stepped back, looked at that wall with completely different eyes. She ran her flashlight along it slowly, and now that she was looking, she could see it. A rectangle, roughly 3 feet wide, 5 feet tall, plastered and painted to match the surrounding wall so precisely that you would never notice it. Not unless you were searching for something wrong. Someone had placed something behind that wall, and someone had gone to considerable effort to make sure nobody would ever find it. Nora stood very still in the quiet farmhouse. flashlight trained on that rectangle. And she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not fear, not desperation. Something closer to the feeling you get at the very beginning of something, when you don't yet know what it is. But every instinct in your body is telling you to pay attention. She went to find the hammer. The one she found was old, pulled from the barn days earlier. Its handle worn glass smooth from decades of use. Its head solid and heavy. Nora stood before that plastered rectangle in the living room wall. She held the hammer for a long, still moment, then swung. The first blow punched clean through. A small cloud of white dust bloomed into the air. She pulled back and struck again, widening the breach. Then she stopped, shone her flashlight into the gap. What waited behind the plaster was not insulation, not framing. Not the hollow dark cavity she'd braced herself for. It was wood. Old wood, gone dark with decades, fitted together with a precision that spoke of deliberate hands. Horizontal planks, smooth and tight-joined. Not structural, something built with purpose. And then sealed away. Nora slowed herself. She began removing plaster in careful sections now, pulling chunks free with her bare hands, setting them down gently, as though the sound might disturb whatever rested behind that wall. 20 minutes of quiet, patient work before the shape revealed itself. A cabinet. Built directly into the wall cavity, framed and fitted with horizontal shelves, spanning the full height and width of that plastered rectangle. The wood was dark walnut, old growth, dense, fine-grained in a way no modern lumber could match. The craftsmanship stopped her breath. Every shelf set perfectly level, smooth, joined with wooden pegs instead of nails. The joinery still tight and clean after what had to be decades sealed in darkness. And on those shelves, objects, wrapped in cloth gone stiff and brown with age. Nora reached in, lifted the nearest bundle, unwrapped it slowly. A glass bottle, dark amber, hand-blown, its shape irregular in a way no machine ever produced. She set it down with care and reached for another. A ceramic pitcher, cream-colored, a blue painted pattern circling its middle. The kind of folk pottery American craftsmen shaped in the early 1800s. The next cloth held a small wooden box with a brass latch. Inside, nested in velvet that had long since deteriorated, a collection of antique coins. She lifted one toward her flashlight. The date pressed into the metal read 1847. She sat back on her heels, looked at what surrounded her. She was no antiques expert, had no particular knowledge of collectibles or historical artifacts. But she understood enough to know this was not junk. These objects had been wrapped with intention and hidden with purpose. Someone had constructed a concealed cabinet inside the wall of this farmhouse and filled it with things they believed worth protecting. The question hung in the dust-thick air. When and why, and what exactly was she holding? If you're enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Chloe appeared in the doorway while Nora was still kneeling on the floor, unwrapped objects spread around her. The girl's eyes went wide. __quote _28 __. She crouched beside her mother, lifting the ceramic pitcher with both hands, careful, deliberate, the way she handled things she already understood were fragile. Quote 29. Nora said. Quote 30. Ben came in behind his sister, spotted the hole in the plaster, and immediately wanted to make it bigger. Nora redirected him to flashlight duty instead. He accepted the assignment with enormous seriousness. They spent the rest of that afternoon documenting everything. Nora photographed each object before and after unwrapping, her phone propped against the wall beside the flashlight to capture clear images. The cabinet held 23 objects in total, glass bottles of various sizes, all hand-blown. 4 pieces of ceramic pottery, each painted by hand. The coin collection alone, over 60 individual coins, dates spanning the 1820s through the 1880s. A small oil lamp, its glass chimney still intact. 2 hand-carved wooden figures, folk art, one a horse, one a human form, both rendered with exceptional detail. And at the very back of the lowest shelf, wrapped in 2 layers of cloth and then a piece of old leather tied with cord, a journal. Small, bound in brown leather, gone dark and rigid with age. Nora untied the cord with careful fingers, opened it to the first page. The handwriting inside was neat and deliberate, the penmanship of someone trained formally in an earlier era. The ink had weathered to a soft brown, but every word remained clear. At the top of that first page, a name written in steady, deliberate hand. Elias Greer. Beneath it, a date. April 1888. Nora lowered herself to the dusty farmhouse floor, her children pressed close on either side, and began reading by the pale glow of her phone. The voice rising from those pages was measured, careful, a man who weighed every word before committing it to paper and stood behind each one. Elias Greer had been a craftsman, a furniture maker, a woodworker, who raised this farmhouse from the ground with his own hands in 1871. He lived within its walls until the end of his days. He never married. He had no children. And in the spring of 1888, feeling his body beginning to fail him, he made a choice about the objects he had spent a lifetime collecting and creating with skilled, patient hands. He chose to hide them, not from fear. Exactly. From something closer to devotion. In his own words, a desire to keep them from those who would sell them without understanding what they were. He believed the right person would find them, eventually. He wrote that he trusted the house itself to hold everything safe until that person arrived. He listed each object placed inside the cabinet, described them one by one, recorded where certain pieces had come from, what they had cost him in time and material and care. Nora turned the pages slowly, touching only the edges with her fingertips. When the last entry ended, she sat in silence for a long while. Then, her gaze moved across the objects spread on the floor around her, and something tightened in her chest. These were not just old things. Elias Greer had been a craftsman of extraordinary skill, working during a period when American folk art and handmade objects reached a quality the modern world had largely abandoned. The coins alone, based on their dates and the fragments of information her phone could pull from the weak signal out here, could carry serious value. The pottery, the glass, the carved figures, the lamp. She needed an expert. Someone who could look at these pieces and truly see them. But sitting there on the floor of a farmhouse her father had purchased for $9, reading the journal of a man dead more than a century, a man who had trusted his house to guard his life's work, Nora Callahan felt something shift deep behind her ribs. Her father had known. He must have known. Walter Grimes bought this property at a tax auction and never did a single thing with it. Never renovated, never sold, never even mentioned it to her directly. But he left it to her, specifically, deliberately, not to Raymond, who would have flipped it the same afternoon. Not to Sylvia, who would have sent a crew to gut the place without glancing twice at anything inside. To her, the one who showed up, the one who paid attention, the one who could recognize what something was worth when nobody else bothered to look. She closed the journal gently, held it in both hands like something living. Beyond the farmhouse windows, the Tennessee fields burned gold in the late afternoon light. Ben had drifted to sleep against her arm. Chloe sat examining the hand-carved horse with quiet intensity, turning it slowly, tracing its lines with one careful finger. Nora watched her daughter and thought about Elias Greer sealing that cabinet in 1888, writing in his journal that the right person would come. She thought about her father spending $9 on a condemned farmhouse and leaving it to the only one of his children who would have walked through the door instead of turning away. Sometimes the most important things in a person's life arrive wearing the disguise of nothing at all. The morning after discovering Elias Greer's hidden cabinet, Nora drove into Millbrook carrying the journal, 3 ceramic pieces wrapped carefully in clean cloth, and the coin collection sealed inside a Ziploc bag she'd found in her glove compartment. She had searched online the night before, fighting the farmhouse's weak signal, and located an antiques shop in town called Harlan Collectibles. A small storefront on the main street. Faded window lettering claimed it had been operating for over 30 years. The owner, a compact, precise woman in her late 60s named Beverly Marsh, looked at what Nora placed on her counter and went very still. The kind of stillness that only comes from genuine expertise meeting something that demands its full attention. Beverly studied each ceramic piece beneath her magnifying glass in total silence. She turned the coins over individually, setting specific ones aside into a careful separate pile. She read 3 full pages of Elias Greer's journal with the sharp focus of someone encountering something that genuinely mattered. Then she removed her magnifying glass and looked at Nora directly. "Where did you get these?" Nora told her. "The farmhouse on Dust Mill Road." Beverly held her gaze for a long moment. "Walter Grimes' property." "Yes," Nora said. "He was my father. He left it to me." Beverly lowered herself onto the stool behind her counter. She stayed quiet long enough that Nora started feeling uncertain. Then Beverly spoke. Quote 31 mid-1800s regional folk art, from a tradition that produced very few surviving examples in this kind of condition. The coins included several that were genuinely rare. A couple she'd want a specialist to verify, but her preliminary read was that the collection as a whole carried real substance. This journal, she tapped the cover gently. If authentic, and she believed it was, it constituted a primary historical document. Elias Greer was a recognized figure in Harlan County craft history. 2 of his pieces sat in the State Museum in Nashville. Nora heard every word and absorbed them steadily, the way she always absorbed significant information. No visible reaction until she'd had time to understand what she was actually being told. "What are we talking about in terms of value?" Beverly folded her hands on the counter. She wanted a full appraisal completed by a qualified specialist before offering any numbers. But speaking as someone who'd spent 31 years in this business, Nora should not sell anything until she knew exactly what she had. What Beverly could say was this: treat those objects as serious assets and handle them accordingly. No resources beyond her own grip and her own stubborn refusal to stop. The same refusal that had kept her breathing through 6 weeks of living in a car with 2 children. She began with the most critical structural damage. The front porch needed stabilizing before it became a genuine danger. She found 4 solid timber posts among the wreckage of the collapsed barn, dragged them one at a time to the front of the house, and used them to shore up the sagging porch supports. She watched a basic carpentry tutorial on her phone 3 times before attempting a single cut. The work consumed 2 full days. Her shoulders ached in a way that felt permanent. But when she finished, the porch stood level and solid. The lean was gone. She moved to the boarded windows next, pulling plywood from inside and out. Clearing shattered glass with gloves she'd improvised from duct tape wrapped tight around her hands. The effect hit immediately. Light flooded the ground floor rooms and changed their entire character. The living room, high ceiling, white fireplace, became something altogether different when morning sun found those windows. Not perfect, not finished, but beautiful in the way honest old structures become beautiful when light reaches them at the right angle. Millbrook began to notice her. She made supply runs in the rusted pickup truck she'd discovered behind the barn. Its engine had seized, but she coaxed it back with fresh oil and a battery purchased on credit from the auto parts store in town. People saw that truck parked outside the hardware store. They saw lights burning in the farmhouse on Dust Mill Road that had stood dark for decades. They asked their questions the way small-town folks always do. Not prying exactly, but curious enough to let it slip through the seams of casual talk. Carl Briggs, no connection to any law firm, was a semi-retired carpenter. 40 years of work on half the houses in Millbrook lived in his hands. He drove past the farmhouse one afternoon and spotted Nora up on the roof, patching damaged shingles with material she'd pulled from the barn. He turned into the drive. He stood at the foot of the ladder, looked up at her. She didn't stop working. Learning, she said. He watched her another minute. Then he walked to his truck, grabbed his own tool belt, climbed the ladder, and settled in beside her. Move over, I'll show you the right way. Carl came back 4 more times across the next 2 weeks. Never called ahead. Always brought something useful, a box of roofing nails, a tube of weatherproof sealant, once an entire sheet of plywood. Leftovers from another job, he said. He refused payment every time Nora tried. Deflected it like it embarrassed him. He had a daughter about her age. He mentioned it once and never brought it up again. B. Holloway, a retired school teacher living 3 miles down the road, appeared one evening carrying a foil-covered casserole and 2 juice boxes for the children. She'd heard about the woman fixing up the old Greer farmhouse. That's what the locals had always called it, and she wanted to see with her own eyes. She stayed 2 hours on the newly stabilized porch. Chloe showed her the hand-carved wooden horse. Ben demonstrated his hard-won expertise with the camp stove. Before she left, she took Nora's hand and held it. Quote 35 Dr. James Whitfield, the Nashville appraiser, a careful, methodical man who specialized in 19th century American material culture, drove down to the farmhouse 3 weeks after Nora's call. He came to examine the full collection in its own setting. 4 hours he spent. Every object photographed. Every piece cross-referenced against his records. Notes filling a leather-bound notebook with quiet, focused intensity. Nora sat across the kitchen table and watched him work. Chloe did homework nearby. Ben had fallen asleep on the newly swept living room floor, a wooden horse tucked under his arm. When Dr. Whitfield finished, he closed the notebook. Looked at Nora with the composed expression of a professional about to deliver significant news. Miss Callahan, he said, I want to be precise, because precision matters here. The ceramic collection, exceptional. Pieces in this condition from this regional tradition, essentially museum quality. The coin collection included 3 genuinely rare specimens. One more he needed to send photographs to a colleague to confirm. His working estimate, he stressed, was conservative. The carved figures, fine examples of Tennessee folk sculpture. The glass, period correct, hand-blown quality excellent. Told him about Raymond's call. The argument being floated. Asked him directly, what exposure did she have? Hawkins was characteristically steady. The artifacts were discovered within the property after title transferred to her. They had never been inventoried as part of the estate, because nobody knew they existed. Under Tennessee property law, contents discovered within an inherited property after transfer of title belonged to the title holder. Their claim had no merit. Code 39, he added. Code 40. People file legal actions for reasons beyond victory. They file to squeeze, to drain resources, to grind down someone they assume can't afford the fight. Nora absorbed every word. She asked what a defense would cost. Hawkins didn't soften it. If they push through discovery, you're looking at serious fees, possibly $50,000 or more, depending on how aggressive they get. Against a collection valued at close to $500,000. A real number. Not devastating given what's at stake, but real. Nora thanked him and hung up. She sat at the kitchen table in the farmhouse Elias Greer had built in 1871, and she thought about what was truly happening here. Her siblings had laughed at her inheritance. They had offered $15,000 for land, and the structure now understood to hold artifacts potentially worth close to $500,000. They had walked out of the will reading without a backward glance. Certain they'd taken everything worth taking. Certain she'd been left with dust. And now that the dust had turned to gold under her hands, They wanted a peace. Not because they'd earned it, not because they'd worked for it, not because they'd spent one single night shivering on a cold floor, choosing to believe. Because it existed. And they didn't have it. Sylvia called 2 days after Raymond. Different approach, softer edges, more personal. She brought up their childhood, their father, how families fracture over money, how she didn't want that for them. She used the word unfair 3 times in the first 5 minutes, every time describing her own situation, never Nora's. She suggested a voluntary split of the artifact proceeds, a third each. The kind of gesture, she said, that would demonstrate the character their father always hoped his children would carry. Nora listened to every word. Then she spoke. Quote 41 __. The softness in Sylvia's voice vanished like steam. You're being selfish, she said. Whatever Raymond and Sylvia threw at her next, she would meet it the same way she met everything. Directly, without flinching. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning in late October. Harland County Courthouse. A solid brick building on the main square of Millbrook. It smelled like floor wax and old wood, carrying that particular institutional hush of places where serious things get decided. Nora arrived early with Theodore Hawkins, who had driven down from Clarksville the evening before. The argument hinged on one assertion, that Walter Grimes had known about the hidden cabinet and its contents when he drafted the will and had deliberately kept that information from the other beneficiaries. It was a constructed argument. Nora had recognized that from the very beginning, but constructed arguments filed with courts still demanded answers, still devoured time and money and energy, and that was precisely the reason they had been filed. The judge assigned to the case was Honorable Ruth Daring, 60 years old. Known throughout Harland County for pushing cases forward without tolerance for anything she deemed a waste of her courtroom's time. Hawkins presented first, methodical, unhurried, exactly as Nora had come to expect him in all things. He submitted documentation from every meeting he had conducted with Walter Grimes during the drafting of the will, his own detailed notes from each session, and the signed affidavit he had prepared, one Walter had signed 6 months before his death, specifically addressing the Dust Mill Road property. He offered this document to Judge Darin with a simple explanation. Walter Grimes had anticipated a legal challenge. He had taken deliberate steps to close that door before anyone could open it. The affidavit stated clearly, in Walter's own words, that the property at 22 Dust Mill Road was being left to Nora Callahan in its entirety. All structures, all land, all contents therein, known and unknown. This distribution reflected his considerate and voluntary judgment made in full possession of his faculties. Judge Daring read the affidavit with care. She set it down. Then she looked at the attorneys for Raymond and Sylvia over the rims of her reading glasses, with an expression that needed no translation. Opposing counsel argued that known and unknown was vague language, insufficient to cover artifacts of significant undisclosed value. Hawkins responded that known and unknown was, in fact, precise language, chosen deliberately to address exactly this possibility. The testator's intent could not have been made clearer without his having torn open the wall himself and snapped a photograph. Judge Daring made a sound that, in any less formal setting, would have passed for a short laugh. Then opposing counsel advanced their secondary argument, the one Nora had been dreading most. They suggested that Nora's prolonged presence as caregiver during the final years of Walter Grimes' life created opportunity for undue influence, that the disproportionate nature of the bequest warranted scrutiny of the circumstances surrounding the will's execution. This was the argument that turned the legal filing into something personal. The suggestion that Nora had manipulated her father, that her care had been calculated rather than genuine, that the woman who had driven 4 hours every few months, organized medications, sat through hospitalizations, had done all of it to position herself for an inheritance. Nora sat at the table beside Hawkins. She kept her face still. She had prepared herself for this. She had known it was coming since the moment Raymond made his first phone call from the barn roof. It still landed hard. Not because it shook her certainty about what she had done or why she had done it, but because it reduced something real, something human and difficult, to a legal tactic. That reduction was its own kind of cruelty. Hawkins responded without raising his voice. He submitted affidavits from Walter Grimes' physician, from his neighbor of 12 years, from the staff of the rehabilitation facility where Walter had spent 6 weeks after his second stroke. Each document attested to Walter's mental clarity, his strong will, his explicit, repeatedly stated pride in Nora's dedication, the complete absence of any indication that his decisions had been shaped by anything other than his own clear judgment. He submitted records showing that Raymond and Sylvia had not visited their father in the final 2 years of his life. Not once. He did not editorialize. He simply placed the documents before the court and let them speak. Judge Daring studied every document placed before her with the precision of someone who'd spent decades reading what people try to hide between the lines. The courtroom had gone still, that particular silence that settles when everyone already knows the verdict before it leaves the judge's mouth. Raymond's jaw was locked tight. Sylvia had abandoned her notepad 20 minutes ago, eyes fixed on the table like it held something she couldn't face. Judge Daring set down the final page and spoke. The claim of undisclosed estate assets, she said, found no support in the will's language or the documented intent of the testator. The claim of undue influence, she continued, was unsupported by any evidence presented, and was, in fact, directly contradicted by the defense's substantial documentation. The motion was denied, every part of it. She said this in a voice that closed the door and bricked it shut. She turned to opposing counsel and noted that the court's time was a shared resource. She hoped their clients understood that. Then she moved to her next case. Nora stayed in her seat after the gavel fell. Hawkins collected his papers with the unhurried calm of a man who had never doubted this ending. Outside, October air hit sharp and bright. The maples around the main square blazed full red. Raymond and Sylvia emerged a minute behind Nora and Hawkins. Their lawyers were already pressing phones to their ears. Raymond looked at Nora from across the courthouse steps. Something new on his face. Not calculation, not contempt, not that careful friendliness he wore when he still wanted something. Just a man in the cold, staring at his sister, with nothing left to say that could matter. Sylvia spoke first. Her voice came out quiet. "I'm sorry," she said, "for all of it." Nora held her gaze for a moment. She believed the apology was genuine, or as genuine as Sylvia could manage under the weight of everything that had happened. "That matters," Nora said. "It just doesn't change anything." She turned and walked with Hawkins toward his car. Behind her, Raymond murmured something low to Sylvia. Sylvia answered. Then silence. Nora did not look back. Hawkins drove her to the farmhouse. Chloe's voice answering him. The building was still condemned on paper. There was still so much work ahead. But it was hers. Completely. Officially. Finally hers. And nobody was going to take it from her. She walked inside to her children. The artifact sale unfolded in stages across the next 3 months. Dr. Whitfield managed it through his network. Specialist dealers, auction houses, private collectors who moved through the quiet, deliberate world of serious American historical objects. Nora had decided early she would not rush. She would not accept the first number anyone put on the table. She had waited long enough already. The right buyers deserved to be found. Dr. Whitfield handled every negotiation with the same careful precision he brought to all things. And Nora sat across from collectors, dealers, museum representatives with that steady attention she had carried through every hard chapter of her life. She listened more than she spoke, asked questions that made clear she understood exactly what she held, declined offers that undervalued her pieces, without apology, without hesitation. The ceramic collection went first. A private collector in Charleston had spent 11 years searching for a complete set of regional Tennessee folk pottery. The price landed at the top of Dr. Whitfield's projected range. The coin collection split between two buyers, a numismatic specialist in Chicago and a private collector in Virginia drawn specifically to the three rarest pieces. The carved wooden figures found their home at a folk art gallery in Nashville, one that had been chasing examples of Tennessee sculpture from that era for a permanent exhibition. The glass bottles and the oil lamp moved through a specialist auction house in Nashville, dealers in 19th century American domestic objects. The journal went last. That sale was the most careful of all. Nora spoke with 4 separate institutions before she accepted an offer from the Tennessee State Museum in Nashville. They wanted it as a permanent addition to their collection of regional craft history documents. They wanted the 2 carved figures too, the Providence documentation. They expressed interest in building a small exhibition around the life and work of Elias Greer. Nora negotiated the journal sale to include a named display, one that credited Elias Greer and the farmhouse at 22 Dust Mill Road. The museum agreed without a moment's pause. When the final transaction cleared and Dr. Whitfield sent her the accounting summary, the total reached $418,000. After his fee and the various auction house commissions, Nora received $371,000. She sat at the kitchen table of the farmhouse, where Elias Greer had once sat. She looked at the number on her phone screen for a long time. It was the largest number ever attached to her name in any context that was not a debt. She did not cry. She sat very still. Let it become real at whatever pace it needed. The first thing she did with the money was not what anyone expected. She did not pay off debt, though she carried some. She did not buy a new car, though hers was barely holding together. The first thing Nora did was call the Harlan County Building Department. She requested a meeting with the county inspector to begin the formal process of reviewing and lifting the condemnation order on 22 Dust Mill Road. She had been working on that farmhouse for months. She knew what it needed structurally, and now she had the resources to do it properly. She wanted it done right. She wanted it done officially. She wanted the building that Elias Greer had raised in 1871 with his own hands to be recognized by the very county that condemned it. Recognized as the sound and valuable structure it actually was. She hired Carl Briggs to oversee the renovation. He accepted with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had been hoping she would ask. She hired locally for everything she could, paid fair wages, took the time to explain to each worker what she was preserving and why it mattered. The cast-iron wood-burning stove in the kitchen was restored by a specialist Carl knew in Knoxville. The white plank floors were cleaned and refinished by hand. Every single board kept original. The fireplace was repointed. The chimney rebuilt from the roofline up. The fire-damaged right side of the house demanded the most. New framing, new exterior walls, but Carl was meticulous about matching materials and methods to the original construction wherever he could. The barn was rebuilt over 6 weeks in early spring. The timber came from trees that had fallen on the property during a winter storm. Nora had set them aside specifically for this purpose. The new barn was structurally modern, but built to look as it had in Elias Greer's time. Board and batten siding, a gambrel roof, wide doors opening south. The collapsed fence along the property line was replaced with split rail, sourced from a farm 2 counties over that was clearing cedar posts from a field. The yard was cleared and planted with a kitchen garden along the south wall. Herbs and vegetables in raised beds built from reclaimed lumber. The same approach Nora had found in Elias Greer's journal, where he described the garden his mother kept in that exact spot. B. Holloway came to see the finished farmhouse on a Saturday in late April. The same day, the county inspector signed off on lifting the condemnation order. She stood on the front porch, solid and level and painted white, and looked at the house and the yard and the barn and the field stretching beyond. Her face held the expression of someone watching a thing restored to what it had always deserved to be. She said quietly, Nora stood beside her, studying it. She had never seen those photographs, yet somehow her hands had brought the place back to what it once was. The open house she held that evening wasn't meant as a celebration, not exactly. It was simpler than that. An acknowledgement that something had been finished, and that the people who poured themselves into it deserved to witness what their effort had become. Carl came with his wife. Beverly Marsh from Harland Collectibles arrived and lingered in the living room, her eyes tracing the wall beside the fireplace. Repaired now, repainted. The hidden cabinet removed, but its outline still ghosting beneath the surface if you knew where to look. Dr. Whitfield drove down from Nashville and moved through every room with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose knowledge had served something real. Theodore Hawkins stood in the kitchen without speaking for a long while. Then he said, "Your father was right about you." That was the only sentence Nora needed. Chloe and Ben tore through the house, the yard, the barn, with the wild freedom of children who understood without anyone explaining it that something permanent had shifted beneath their feet. Ben had claimed the left side bedroom months ago. He taped his own drawings to the wall, sketches of the farmhouse at different stages of renovation, arranged in rough order from ruin to completion. Nora found that timeline more moving than she could put into words. Chloe had asked to keep a photograph of Elias Greer, a formal portrait from the 1880s provided by the Tennessee State Museum. A lean, careful-looking man with a woodworker's hands. It hung now in a small frame on the living room wall, near where the hidden cabinet had been, because Chloe said he deserved to see what happened to his house. Nora agreed without hesitation. That evening, after everyone had gone, she stood on the rooftop deck she'd built from reclaimed lumber at the back of the house. Warm April darkness pressed in. The fields stretched invisible around her. The creek murmured at the far edge of the property. The farmhouse held steady beneath her feet. She thought about the morning of the will reading, Raymond laughing, Sylvia shaking her head. The key, cold, heavy in her palm. She thought about 6 weeks sleeping in the car. The first night on the floor of a condemned building. 1 blanket, 2 children breathing beside her. City noise bleeding through shattered windows. She thought about the hammer in her grip, and the wall that cracked open, and the objects wrapped in brown cloth on a shelf that had waited in darkness for 130 years, waited for exactly the right hands to reach them. Her phone buzzed, a message from Raymond. 5 words. "I heard it's beautiful." Nora read it once and placed the phone face down on the railing. She would answer eventually. Maybe the apology carried enough weight, or something close enough to weight, that it deserved a response. But not tonight. Tonight belonged to the farmhouse and the fields and the creek and the 2 children sleeping inside and the craftsman whose journal had promised the right person would come, and the father who had known, with the bone-deep certainty of a man who truly understood his children, exactly who that person would be. Walter Grimes paid $9 for a condemned farmhouse and left it to the daughter everyone else had pitied. What he actually gave her was everything. Not the artifacts, not the money, not even the land. He gave her the chance to discover what she was made of when everything else had been stripped away, and all that remained was herself and the key that fit a lock nobody else had bothered to try. She had opened it, she had walked through, and what she built on the other side of that door, the home, the life, the proof of her own capacity, was worth more than any figure Dr. Whitfield had ever recorded in his notebook. Nora Callahan looked out across the dark Tennessee fields. She drew in the cold spring air, and she felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, completely and entirely at peace. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting right on your screen. If this one landed, those will too. Just click and dive in. And make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new upload.